Well, hello. My name is Tony Hicks. Many of you know me, but just in case you don't, I'm a former pastor, pastored for 20 years in Louisiana. I'm now a high school history teacher. I'm a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary, in which I had a great opportunity to learn a lot, and I love teaching God's Word. I had gone through a period of teaching online for a few years and took a break from that, and now I want to restart. Now, what am I going to teach as we begin this? Well, I want to go through the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes is a book that probably most people don't know a lot about. It's a book that maybe many of you have never read. It's not a real long book, and it's nestled in the Old Testament, but I think it's a very important book, and I think there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom that we can gain from understanding the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, some opening thoughts here. The book of Ecclesiastes is in what we call in the Old Testament the wisdom literature. Now, what is the wisdom literature? Well, there's different groupings of it, but I look at it as primarily Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Some would maybe put Psalms in it. I don't necessarily. Some would put Song of Solomon in the wisdom literature, and that's debatable. But I'm working with the idea of the wisdom literature being Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Now, what is the wisdom literature? Well, the term wisdom in the Bible speaks to a lot more than our current understanding of what wisdom would be. If someone asked you for a definition of what wisdom is, we would probably say something like wisdom is the ability to use knowledge in a profitable way. And that's okay as far as it goes. But from a biblical standpoint, wisdom is much more than that. Wisdom is living wisely in accordance with God's word and God's commands. That is the basis of wisdom. Within the wisdom literature, you see sometimes mentioned the wise man, and then sometimes he's countered by the fool. Well, the wise man is not that he's necessarily smarter than everyone else, but he lives his life in accordance with God's law and in accordance with God's ways. Contrarily, the fool may be intelligent, may be very intelligent. He may be very smart in the ways of the world, but he disregards God, disregards God's commands, and does not live his life in regard to that. So that, in essence, is what the wisdom literature is about. And in the book of Proverbs, we see this with generally short statements of wisdom. A wise son makes a glad father, but then talks about how one who is disobedient is a grief to his mother. So a lot of times in the Proverbs, there's a statement of truth and then a contrary statement. And so the Proverbs are general truths of what is the case for those who live in accordance with God's word. But then we have the books of Ecclesiastes and Job, and they give us a different viewpoint. Now, I'm not saying that the books of Job and Ecclesiastes contradict Proverbs. I'm saying it's a different perspective. We know the story of Job. Job is a man who was righteous, and we know all of the story, and yet God allowed Satan to inflict him, and he suffered greatly. We know the beginning of the book of Job, we know the ending of the book of Job, but Job's a very large book, and there's a lot in the middle of philosophical and wisdom-type discussions about evil and about the nature of God and things such as that. And Ecclesiastes, you might say, does that on a mini basis. Because here's what it comes down to. Life is far more complicated than just simple statements. There are bad things in life. There are hard things in life. And just the fact that you are a righteous person does not mean you may not suffer wrong in this life. And the book of Ecclesiastes talks about that. It talks about how the wicked man may prolong his life. He may live a long life, and yet the righteous man may die young. And so he talks about things that seem kind of contradictory to us. He will say, the fool does these things, and yet I may be wise, and I'm going to die too, and I end up in the same place that the fool ends up. So it deals with reality. But here's what I would say about the book of Ecclesiastes. It deals with living life in a fallen world. Living life in a fallen world in which things are difficult. It is not talking about eternity. There are times when the author of Ecclesiastes will speak to the fact there's a judgment coming. He says it will be good for the righteous. And so he's not discounting that there's an eternity, and he's not discounting that there's a judgment. But his focus is upon living life in this world that is fallen and in which things do not happen as we would like them to happen. And even though we may try our best to live wisely and live in accordance with God's word, we may not profit in this life. And that is a reality that we all know from living. And so the writer of Ecclesiastes, and we'll talk about that and who it is in a few minutes, speaks to that in the book of Ecclesiastes. And so I think it's a very important book. It's a very rich book. It gives us so much within this book. Now, why do we have a book called Ecclesiastes? Well, let's look at the first verse of the book of Ecclesiastes. It begins by saying, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, let's hold off on the identity of the speaker. The words of the preacher. The title of the book, Ecclesiastes, is actually not a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word. And you say, well, why do we have a Greek title to a Hebrew book? Well, this happens because in the 2nd century BC, about 125 BC or so, the Old Testament was translated from the Hebrew into Greek. Now, it's understandable why that happened, because the world at that time was a Greek world. Alexander the Great had conquered the world 200 years before that. Greek culture had spread throughout the Eastern world, the Middle Eastern world, in that place. That's why the New Testament is written in Greek, because even at that point, even though the Romans are now in charge and the Romans are ruling that part of the world, they conquered the Greeks, the Greek language was still the predominant language. So it's understandable they would translate the Old Testament into Greek. And so a lot of books in the Old Testament have Greek titles. For example, the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis. Genesis is a Greek word. The Hebrew title for Genesis is Bereshit, which means in the beginning. It's actually the first word in the Hebrew Bible. But when they translated it as Genesis, which means beginning. The same thing with Exodus. Exodus is a Greek word. Deuteronomy is a combination of two Greek words, which means second law. So this takes place in several books of the Old Testament, and that's why we have this book called Ecclesiastes. Now, why is it called Ecclesiastes? Well, the title for the book in Hebrew is Kohelet. Kohelet. And I'll show that to you. And what Kohelet means, it is a word that speaks to a person who addresses an assembly. Now, those of you who know a little bit about New Testament Greek, you will recognize in Ecclesiastes the word ekklesia, which is the New Testament Greek word for church that is translated as church. Ecclesia means assembly. It means a gathering. So Ecclesiastes speaks to a person who addresses an assembly, which is exactly what the word kohelet means, a person who addresses an assembly. So that's why you will see it called the words of the preacher. Since he is an addresser of the assembly, they say he is the preacher, and that is the general translation. If you go, and if you're familiar with the King James, and if you're familiar with the King James Version, you will notice the title says Ecclesiastes, or the preacher. So that's why it's called Ecclesiastes. Now, who wrote Ecclesiastes? Now that's a big question, and it's not an easy question. There's a historical answer, and then there's a modern scholarly answer. But historically, it has been said that the book of Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon, and I do believe that. Let's look at what it says at the beginning of the book. It says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Well, he's the son of David, so that limits it. He is the king in Jerusalem, which means he's either the king over the United Kingdom or he's the king over the southern kingdom in a later time. So you can narrow it down quite a lot. And there's a lot of discussion about this, and I don't want to discount anything that people who are far more scholarly than me will say about this, because they have good arguments. But I'm going to operate under the assumption that this is Solomon. I believe the tradition is correct. I believe it fits. He says down in verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. So he's speaking as someone who is the king. And this sounds, and it very much like an older Solomon reflecting upon sometimes the lack of wisdom in his younger years. If you know the story of Solomon, you know that he was the wisest king that ever lived, but he also did some very foolish things. He married many foreign women. He did a lot of things that were contrary to the wisdom of the Bible. So it does have the feel that this is an older Solomon reflecting upon his many years. And he talks of living, and he talks about how I have investigated and I've looked into these things. So in terms of authorship, I do take it to be Solomon. So we will begin with that. And I think I'm going to stop there, because to go further, we would have to begin the text, and I really think that we'll save that for the next session. So I hope you will join me when we start back with this again. I will begin with the first part of Ecclesiastes, and we're going to take our time going through this book. It's a very deep book. It's got a lot of detail to it, and it's got a lot of great wisdom. So I hope that you will join us next time. God bless you.